Hey guys, tonight we drift softly into a world of cold stone, dim firelight, and the quiet stubbornness of people who refused to die when the world around them tried very hard to make that happen. We are sinking back into the Middle Ages, into villages that no longer exist, into winters that cut like knives, and into the small, careful habits that meant the difference between seeing spring or not. If you enjoy these slow wanderings through history, you can gently like and subscribe, and you can let a few words rest in the comments, telling where you are listening from and what time it is, wherever your own night is unfolding. Settle in as we explore the forgotten techniques medieval people used to stay alive, not in grand battles or glittering courts, but in muddy fields, smoky kitchens, and cramped wooden rooms where the wind crept under every door. Let the details wash over you like a quiet, repetitive tide. There is no urgency here, just the soft scratching of quills on parchment, the hiss of wet wood on an open hearth, the rustle of straw mattresses as someone turns in their sleep and pulls the blanket closer against the cold. Somewhere in the distance a church bell is marking the hours, and a dog gives a half-hearted bark before curling back into itself. Tonight, the Middle Ages are not loud or dramatic. They are slow, practical, and careful. They are full of people doing the same motions, day after day, so that when the next winter comes, there will still be someone left to hear the bell. First, the forgotten art of turning rot into survival. Medieval food preservation that outsmarted winter before thinking about swords. Or castles' survival in the Middle Ages began with something far less romantic, keeping yesterday's food from killing you tomorrow. Medieval people lived under a constant, quiet pressure. Grain might fail, storms might ruin the harvest, or a lord might simply demand more than a family could spare. So they built their lives around stretching abundance into scarcity, and turning a brief season of plenty into something that could be chewed slowly in January, when the fields slept under frost. In a low, timbered house near the edge of a village, you can imagine late autumn air thick with the smell of salt and wood smoke. On a rough wooden table lies a side of pork, pale and heavy, surrounded by a drift of coarse, glistening crystals. Hands that have done this every year push the salt into every fold and joint, pressing it deep, turning pink flesh grainy and stiff. It is not elegant work. It is repetitive, almost ritualistic. A layer of meat, a layer of salt, another layer of meat, the sound of heavy breathing, the small grunt as a barrel lid is dragged into place. Somewhere nearby lies this simple awareness that if this is not done properly, there will be fewer people alive in March. Salt was the silent engine of medieval preservation. Meat and fish were buried in it, rubbed with it, soaked in strong brine until the last trace of softness was chased out. Vegetables, too, were sometimes tucked away in layers of salt or steeped in brine, turned from living green things into something sturdier, chewier, and far more durable. Everything tasted aggressively salted, of course, but the alternative was the sour reek of spoilage and the slow march of hunger. Hanging above the hearth, a different kind of alchemy was taking place. Cured meats and fish dangled on hooks, slowly darkening as smoke curled around them day after day. The air in such a house was never truly clear. There was always a gentle haze, a swirling mixture of burning oak, damp thatch, and the faint sweetness of fat. Children would grow up breathing it, squinting a little in the half-light, inhaling months of future meals. Smoking and drying transformed soft, vulnerable food into something hard, dense, and astonishingly long-lived. Fish like cod could be dried until it turned into something almost like a plank, rigid, knocking woodenly against other pieces as it was stacked. Later, it would need hours of soaking and boiling to become edible again. A process that turned cooking into a patient waiting game. But that block of fish was a promise. It sat on a shelf or in a storage loft whispering, "There will be protein in February. There will be a reason to keep waking up." Underground, the earth itself was pressed into service. Cellars and cool chambers, cut into hillsides or tucked beneath stone houses, became quiet. Dark refrigerators long before anyone knew that word. A door would open with a soft creak, and a breath of cooler, damper air would brush the face. Shelves lined with crockery and barrels waited in the gloom, holding root vegetables, cheeses, casks of ale, and the slow, ticking heart of the household's survival plan. Fermentation added another layer of hidden genius. Cabbages shredded and packed into salted brine became something sharper and more complex over time, their crispness giving way to sour tenderness. Jars and barrels burbled quietly as invisible armies of bacteria transformed simple vegetables into storable, nutritious food with new flavors. The process would have seemed almost magical to many medieval villagers, who lacked the vocabulary for microbes but very much understood that this barrel doesn't tea rot like the others, and it keeps us alive. Fruits, when they were available in any excess at all, might be dried in the sun or packed into honey, which acted as both sweetener and shield. Honey, with its thick, golden resistance to decay, wrapped fragile slices of apple or pear in something that could sit for months. Opening such a pot in the middle of winter must have felt like unsealing a tiny piece of late summer. The scent of concentrated fruit and honey would rise in the cold room, a reminder that the world could be warm and generous again. Of course, all of this took time. It took hard, monotonous labor, hauling salt, tending fires, turning meat, checking barrels. Modern people might glance at a smoked ham in a museum case and think of it as a rustic decoration. Medieval people saw it as security. They thought these methods would work, and somehow they did, over and over, across centuries of hard seasons and uncertain years. But that leads us gently to another quiet, essential art, the crafting and guarding of fire itself. Next, the discipline of flame, how medieval people lit, carried, and tamed fire without matches in the medieval world. Fire was both a gift and a constant threat. It warmed, boiled, baked, and smelted, but it also burned down entire streets of houses in a single bad night. There were no matches to strike, no convenient lighters. Starting a new fire from nothing was effort, skill, and sometimes luck. So people learned to think about flame the way a modern person thinks about a passport or a phone battery. You do not lose it if you can help it. At dawn, in a half-lit hall, Someone might kneel by the central hearth and gently stir a nest of white-grey ash. The surface looks dead, but an experienced hand knows where to find the living heart. A twist of iron or a charred stick uncovers a tiny glow, no bigger than a seed. Ash is brushed aside, a breath is given, and the ember brightens from dull peach to a stronger orange. Dry twigs, saved carefully in a corner, are laid on top, then slightly larger ones. The process is almost meditative. Add, wait, listen to the faint crackle, feel the growing warmth on the face. A fire revived from last night's coals is one that did not need to be painfully created anew. When the coals died, or when people were away from home, other methods were needed. Flint and steel, or similar tools like iron struck against pyrite, were the core medieval answer. It was not as simple as a single striking gesture, like in a film. A person might sit, hunched, a piece of steel in one hand and a sharp-edged rock in the other, tapping and scraping like some abstract, patient sculptor. Each strike produced a brief, bright spark that had to land precisely on tinder. Tinder was not just something dry. It was curated, prepared material. Rotten wood, birch bark peeled from trees, dried grass, fine shavings of pine. Even char-cloth made by partially burning linen and smothering it so it charred, rather than turned to ash. Char-cloth was especially helpful because it caught a spark and held it in a slow, glowing smolder that could then be coaxed into a flame. To create it, scraps of old linen, perhaps from a worn-out shirt, were carefully burned in a controlled way, turning soft white fibers into black, velvety sheets of fragile carbon. It looked useless, but to anyone responsible for a household's warmth, it was precious. Once that first tiny coal bloomed in the tinder, the next stage was breath. Not a wild blowing that scattered everything, but a controlled exhalation, cheeks close, eyes narrowed against the smoke. The smell of scorched fiber and warm resin would rise, followed by the start of a real flame licking at the smallest sticks. Only then could bigger pieces be added. This small drama of spark and breath played out thousands of times a day across medieval Europe. Because creating fire was such trouble, people treated it like an heirloom. Hearths might be carefully banked at night, coals buried under ash or covered with ceramic or metal shields that kept just enough oxygen moving to avoid complete extinction. A neighbor whose fire had gone out might come with a small pot or bundle, seeking hot coals from someone else's hearth. The community, in a sense, shared flame the way modern people share information or electricity. The danger of fire, however, was never far away. A thatched roof was a brilliant piece of insulation. More on that later, but it was also vulnerable to sparks. Many medieval towns insisted on buckets of water kept ready outside houses, so that when a blaze started, an impromptu human chain could form, passing sloshing containers hand to hand in a frantic, rhythmic movement. Firehooks were used to pull down burning thatch before flames could leap to the next roof. A desperate but often necessary method of sacrifice to save the wider settlement. In some places, particularly where wooden structures crowded together, separate cookhouses were built so that the worst of the heat and flames stayed away from sleeping areas and granaries. Brewers and other workers whose crafts involved constant fire were sometimes tightly regulated. Instructed to whitewash or plaster their buildings to reduce flammability, all of this speaks to a world where survival was not only about having fire, but about making sure fire did not erase everything else you had managed to hold on to. The medieval person's relationship with flame was one of disciplined respect. They thought that if they controlled and honored it, it would behave. It did not always agree, but the combination of careful techniques, tinder preparation, ember banking, cooperative sharing of coals, strict rules around fire sources, meant that most nights ended not in disaster, but in the familiar dim orange halo flickering against wooden beams, while people rolled into their blankets and drifted toward sleep. As the sun dipped lower and the hearth burned steadily, people withdrew indoors. Inside those cramped rooms, another survival trick was at work, almost invisible to the modern eye, using architecture, animal warmth, and clothing like portable shelters against the cold. Then the quiet architecture of warmth, half-thatched bodies, and will against the medieval cold contrary to the popular picture of the Middle Ages as one endless shiver. Medieval people actually had surprisingly effective strategies for staying warm with almost nothing. The methods were not always comfortable in the modern sense, but they were clever, layered, and relentless. Homes, clothing, and daily routines were all shaped by the simple question: how do we waste as little heat as possible? The central hearth, a glowing heart in the middle of a hall, did more than cook soup. It was a heat engine, radiating warmth in all directions, rising into the rafters, and seeping into stone floors and wooden benches. In many houses, smoke drifted up through a hole or louver in the roof, but not before it had lingered just long enough to warm the air, dry out thatch, and discourage insects. It made the room hazy, yes, and hard on the lungs over a lifetime. But it also transformed a freezing space into something at least survivable. People did not imagine the hearth fire as a decorative accent. It was the organizing center of the room. Benches, tables, and beds arranged themselves around it like petals around a flower. Children slept closer in winter. Older people were given the prime warm spots. And even visiting animals found their way to the ring of relative comfort. The floor, often made of packed earth or rough planks, absorbed warmth slowly over the day, releasing it back like a very primitive underfloor heating system once the flames had died down. Above, the thatched roof, which modern visitors sometimes dismiss as quaint, was a sophisticated piece of thermal technology. Thick layers of straw, reeds, or heather, carefully laid and compressed, trapped pockets of air and shed water. Snow sliding off such roofs did not always mean poor insulation. Sometimes it meant the upper layers stayed just warm enough to clear, while the thickness beneath still held the heat inside. These roofs could last years if maintained, and they helped keep interior temperatures less brutal in both summer and winter. Windows, where they existed at all, were another battlefield. Clear glass was a luxury. Many poorer homes had small openings that could be shuttered with wood, or covered with oiled cloth or stretched parchment to keep out drafts, while still admitting a faint smear of light. In the evening, shutters closed with a dull thud, and gaps were stuffed with moss, rags, or bits of wool. A quiet, unromantic defense against freezing air. Beds told their own story of survival. Instead of thick mattresses with springs, medieval sleepers lay on straw pallets, sometimes with a layer of wool or cloth on top to keep the sharpest stems from poking. Straw, changed periodically as it grew dusty and flat, was not just convenient filler. It was another way of trapping air and creating a buffer between body and icy floor. In wealthier homes, feather beds offered a softer, more insulating cushion. But the principle was the same. Raise the body up, surround it with trapped air, let it warm its own little bubble. Bed covers might include woolen blankets, furs, and even cloaks that had been worn during the day. Families commonly slept several to a bed or to a room, which modern sensibilities might find intrusive, but which was wonderfully efficient in terms of shared heat. A tangle of limbs, breaths, and dreams under a single blanket created a small ecosystem of warmth. There were jokes and concerns about lice, of course, but the trade-off was simply accepted. Solitude was a luxury that could cost fingers and toes. Clothing functioned as a second home. Medieval wool, when spun and woven well, was an extraordinary survival material. It retained warmth even when damp, and could be layered easily. A peasant might wear linen close to the skin, wool over that, and perhaps a cloak or hooded garment on top. The hood, in particular, was vital. It protected neck, ears, and head, capturing rising body heat that would otherwise escape into the indifferent sky. Shepherds and other outdoor workers developed their own micro-techniques. Some moved constantly rather than resting for long stretches in the open cold, alternating brief, curled-up naps with periods of walking or tending animals. Hands were warmed around embers, bodies sheltered behind low stone walls or hedges that broke the wind. They thought in small increments. Keep the fingers warm for the next hour. Keep the feet dry for the next mile. And eventually one arrived at spring. Where possible, heated objects were pressed into service. Beds might be pre-warmed with stones heated near the fire and wrapped in cloth, or with embers carefully enclosed in metal or ceramic containers and slid between covers, to take the edge off the chill before someone lay down. The faint hiss when a very slightly damp cloth met hot stone, the brief smell of warmed linen, would have been part of the nightly ritual. These tools were primitive bed warmers in all but name. The sarcastic modern observer might note that many of these methods look like desperation rather than design, but they worked. They kept people's blood moving and their joints unfrozen. They used physics intuitively, capture radiant heat, trap air, minimize drafts, layer insulation. In an age without thermostats, someone still knew, by feel and habit, exactly how many logs to add, how thick the thatch should be, and how tightly to tuck straw around a sleeping child. As bodies kept their warmth, another problem quietly demanded attention, making sure there was something safe to drink that would not, itself, become a cause of death. That problem, too, had medieval answers we rarely think about now. Now, the alchemy of dirty water. How medieval people turned questionable sources into drinkable survival clean water in the Middle Ages was not guaranteed. Wells could run low or become fouled. Rivers doubled as drains. And stagnant ponds collected whatever the surrounding landscape gave them. Yet people still had to drink, cook, and brew. So they developed a patchwork of methods, some shockingly effective, some more superstition than science, to tilt the odds away from disease and towards survival. Imagine a small village at the edge of a forest, with a single, much-used pond squatting nearby like a dull, brown eye. Ducks probe at its surface, children throw stones into it, and laundry has been rinsed along its banks more often than anyone remembers. Left as is, that water is a microbial festival. But to a medieval householder, it is also a resource that simply cannot be ignored. One of the simplest tricks was basic filtration. A cloth, perhaps an old piece of linen or wool, could be stretched over the mouth of a bucket or pot, catching visible debris, insects, and larger particles as murky water was poured through. It did not make the water clear as glass, but it removed the worst of the floating filth, a first, humble layer of protection against the unknown. People could see the difference, and that alone made the act feel worthwhile. Beyond that, some communities, especially in monastic settings, went much further. Cistercian and other monasteries, with their focus on order and cleanliness, developed elaborate systems of channels, settling tanks, and sand layers to transform raw water into something much safer. Gravity did much of the work. Water flowed slowly through beds of sand and gravel, where physical particles were trapped and microbial life began to meet its patient end in a biological film that developed on the surface layers. Monks may not have known the modern term for this slimy, life-rich layer, often called a schmutzstick in later engineering, but they observed its effects. Water emerging from the system was clearer, tasted better, and made people sick less often. This slow sand filtration was engineering disguised as devotion. A cloister's quiet garden might conceal, just beneath or beside it, carefully lined channels that took in raw stream water, passed it through deliberately chosen sand beds, and delivered a much safer supply to the community. While peasants in crowded towns suffered from periodic outbreaks of waterborne disease, many monastic populations enjoyed relatively better health reinforced by cleaner drinking water and stricter hygiene. For those without such systems, boiling was the universal fallback, though it was not always the first choice because fuel was precious. Heating large amounts of water over a fire demanded wood or charcoal that might be needed for cooking or metalwork. When boiling was used, however, it provided powerful insurance. In earlier and poorer contexts, where metal pots were rare or expensive, people turned to a surprisingly elegant solution: hot stone boiling. Stones were heated directly in the fire until they glowed faintly, or at least became too hot to touch. Then, using wooden tongs or other tools, they were dropped into wooden troughs or other non-metal containers filled with water. The stones hissed, cracked slightly sometimes, and released their heat into the liquid, bringing it close to or up to a boil without ever putting the container itself onto the flames. It looked a bit like magic, rocks making water dance and steam, but it was simply an early form of thermal transfer, put to work for survival. Alongside these more physical techniques, herbs and natural substances were used to tilt the balance. Further, sprigs of thyme or other aromatic plants might be dropped into stored water, both to improve the smell and as we now know, to add mild antimicrobial effects. Willow bark, rich in salicin and other compounds, could be boiled to produce a liquid with antiseptic and medicinal properties, then sometimes mixed into questionable water in the hope of reducing its harmfulness. While people spoke of these additions in terms of freshness or purifying in a spiritual sense, the practical outcomes were often genuinely beneficial. Perhaps the most quietly effective medieval habit, however, was to avoid drinking plain water when possible. Beer and ale, even when weak, were safer than raw river water because the brewing process involved boiling and fermentation, which discouraged or killed many pathogens. Children in some regions drank low-alcohol beer as a daily staple, their bodies fueled and hydrated by a liquid that had already been through the purifying fire. Wine, where available, was similarly diluted with water, adding acidity and lowering microbial survival. Then there were the rules of distance and cleanliness. Wells were often protected with stone linings, covers, or even simple ownership customs that discouraged people from washing clothes or dumping waste nearby. Villagers learned, sometimes painfully after outbreaks of sickness, that certain behaviors around water sources meant the difference between a healthy year and a deadly one. Over time, these observations solidified into unspoken commandments. Do not foul the well. Keep latrines downhill and downstream. Let animals drink elsewhere if possible. Taken individually, each of these practices might seem modest. A cloth filter here, a sprig of thyme there, a preference for ale over raw water. But survival is often a mosaic of small decisions layered on top of each other. Medieval people did not have microscopes, but they had pattern recognition, and they built their lives around tiny, accumulated insights. They thought these tricks would keep them alive. Very often, they were right as bodies were warmed and thirst was cautiously answered. Another constant mission never really stopped: the search for calories beyond what the plow and field provided. That meant moving through landscapes in ways modern people would barely recognize. Next, the patient harvest of the wild, foraging, gleaning, and eating the landscape of most medieval villagers. The forest, meadow, and hedgerow were not decorative scenery. They were a slow, sprawling pantry that demanded knowledge instead of cash. Modern people sometimes treat foraging as a hobby, an optional weekend outing. In the Middle Ages, failure at foraging could mean the thinning of the family line. Picture a late summer morning, mist still clinging to the edges of a field. A woman with a basket on her arm and children trotting at her heels moves along the hedges, eyes flicking from plant to plant. She is not sightseeing, she is inventorying. Here, a cluster of blackberries, already familiar. There, a patch of nettles, leaves prickly but tender when cooked. Further along, wild sorrel, its tangy taste brightening otherwise bland porridges. The children learn, one leaf at a time, what can go into the pot and what must be left for the crows. Mushrooms were a more dangerous gift. Certain communities developed meticulous, almost ritual knowledge of which mushrooms to gather, when and how to prepare them. A wrong choice could lead to shaking, vomiting, and death. Experiences that entire families would recount in whispers for generations. So rules were memorized with the weight of survival. This capped with this skill, at this time of year, from this kind of tree's roots, safe, that other shape, near that kind of stump, forbidden. Beyond obvious plants, the medieval diet quietly leaned on what might be called edge foods, things gathered from the margins, between cultivated land and wilderness. Nuts from forest trees offered concentrated fats and proteins that were rare in diets otherwise dominated by grain. Acorns, when properly leached of their bitterness, could be ground and used as supplementary flour. Haws, sloes, crab apples, and other hard, sour fruits were collected, dried, stewed, or fermented into crude but serviceable preserves. The rhythm of gleaning followed the harvest. Once a lord's fields had been officially reaped, poorer villagers, sometimes especially women and children, moved in to pick over what remained. Bent nearly double, they gathered single stalks of grain dropped by scythes, small piles of ears left behind, anything that the formal harvest overlooked. The work was slow, backbreaking, and humbling, but a bag of gleaned grain might be the difference between a lean winter and a catastrophic one. Animals played their part in this extended foraging system. Pigs, especially, were essentially living, self-propelled conversion engines, turning forest mast and scraps into meat. Let loose in woodlands during pannage season, they rooted among fallen nuts and roots, their snuffling, grunting progress echoing faintly between trunks. Their human keepers listened not just for the sound of the herd, but for the forest itself. Shifts in bird calls, the distant crack of a branch, the changing scent of the air that might hint at predators or strangers. Fishing too was often less about romantic boats on broad rivers, and more about clever small-scale traps set in streams and ponds. Weirs, wicker baskets, and nets fashioned from local fibers turned flowing water into a quiet collaborator in survival. A child might check a trap at dawn, fingers numb from the chill, and find just enough silver flickers inside to make a soup that tasted faintly of something other than cabbage and grain. Even in winter, when most plants hid beneath frozen ground, certain knowledge paid off. The inner bark of some trees, though not exactly delicious, could be scraped, dried, and ground as emergency filler for bread. Roots like parsnips and turnips stored carefully from autumn were retrieved one by one, their earth-clinging skins a reminder that the ground could still give, even when its surface seemed dead. There was sarcasm hidden in the universe's layout. The best survival foods were often the least impressive. A handful of bitter greens with useful vitamins, a cluster of small fish, a basket of gnarly nuts that took forever to crack. High cuisine this was not, but the formal, documented recipes of lords and monasteries, carefully written in Latin, were only the tip of the culinary iceberg. Beneath them lay a vast, largely unwritten folk menu, compiled through centuries of observation, trial, error, and the thin but continuous line of families that managed, somehow, not to disappear. Alongside the wild harvest ran another set of habits focused on something more subtle, keeping bodies functional and uninfected long enough to make use of all this food. Medieval medicine gets mocked easily, but tucked inside the leeches. And astrological charts were practical survival techniques we rarely credit. But that leads us gently to now stitches, splints, and bitter brews everyday medieval first aid that actually worked without modern hospitals, ambulances, or antibiotics. Medieval people were forced into a kind of medical realism. They could not cure everything. They knew this. But they also developed a toolkit of surprisingly effective strategies to handle injuries and illnesses that would otherwise have ended lives or livelihoods very quickly. Start with the simplest kind of disaster: a broken bone on a muddy road. A slip, a crunch, a scream. Without intervention, such a fracture could heal badly, leaving a person crippled in a world that had no space for those who could not work. So villagers learned by bitter experience how to set and immobilize limbs. Wooden splints, carved or cut from whatever was at hand, were padded with cloth and bound with linen strips to keep bones as straight as possible while they knit. Archaeological remains show many medieval bones that healed well enough for their owners to return to heavy labor, a silent testimony to untrained but steady hands doing decent orthopedic work. Sometimes more inventive measures were used. Clay mixed with binding agents, like egg whites, could be spread around a splinted limb, hardening into a crude but effective cast that kept everything sturdily in place. When you imagine this, do not picture clean hospital plaster. Imagine instead a rough, earthy casing, smelling faintly of wet soil and poultry, hardening slowly in the corner of a dim house while the patient gritted their teeth and tried not to move. For wounds, herbs and plant-based salves formed a first line of defense. Honey, with its natural antibacterial properties and high sugar content, appeared in many remedies as both a soothing dressing and a barrier to infection. Poultices made from garlic, onion, and other strongly scented plants may not have tasted great, but some of their components have real antiseptic effects. In monasteries and among learned physicians, texts preserved and adapted classical knowledge about certain herbs promoting healing or reducing inflammation. Cleanliness, within the limits of what was practical, also mattered more than stereotypes suggest. Bathing cultures varied across regions and centuries, but washing hands and faces before meals, rinsing wounds, and boiling linens were not unknown habits. In crowded towns, public bathhouses and stews offered at least occasional immersion in hot water, even if they also presented their own fascinating array of health risks. In villages, a simple tub near the fire and heated water from the hearth could turn into a makeshift treatment. Room where injured limbs were cleaned and bandages changed. Teeth, often a quiet source of misery, were addressed with crude but direct methods. Aching teeth might be packed with herbs, rubbed with sour wine, or eventually pulled by someone with a reasonably steady hand and a strong stomach. Again, not pleasant, but an abscess left to fester could kill. At some point, the pain of removal was judged better than the slow burn of infection. Many medieval remedies mixed real pharmacological effects with spiritual and superstitious overlays. A charm might be said while a wound was bound, or a saint invoked as herbs were pounded in a mortar. To modern eyes, the spoken words do nothing, but they served to calm the patient, structure the healer's actions, and embed the treatment in a larger story about order and meaning. In survival terms, lowering a terrified patient's panic can be as valuable as the herbs themselves. There were, unquestionably, catastrophic errors. Bloodletting could weaken already fragile bodies. Some poultices introduced more contamination than they prevented. Yet alongside these missteps, a pragmatic core persisted. Immobilize what is broken, keep wounds as clean as you can, use plants that seem to reduce swelling or infection, and rely on the body's own stubborn tendency to repair itself when given a chance. It is quietly impressive that so many peasant skeletons show evidence of healed fractures, even of major long bones, in people who then went back to carrying loads, swinging tools, and enduring winters. They thought their improvised casts and splints would hold. Walking through a field centuries later, holding one of those healed bones, a modern archaeologist has to admit they did. As bodies held together and seasons turned, another threat took a more psychological shape. Fear of misfortune, of unseen forces, of the unpredictable cruelty of weather, war, and disease. Medieval survival here leaned not only on tools and knowledge, but on a lattice of charms, rituals, and symbolic defenses. But that leads us gently to next. Invisible armor, charms, iron, and the superstitions that kept people going. Survival is not purely physical. A person who believes nothing can protect them may give up more quickly, lose will, or make panicked choices. Medieval people wrapped themselves, their homes, and their journeys in a web of symbols meant to anchor them in a dangerous world. Some of those symbols had faint but real practical effects. Others worked mostly through the mind. Take the simple iron horseshoe, nailed above a doorway. To the medieval eye, this was not a quaint decoration. It was a barrier against malevolent forces. Iron, associated with strength and weapons, was thought to repel spirits and witches. The curved shape of the horseshoe itself was said to trap wandering entities, holding them fast and keeping them from entering the home. Whether or not that was true in a supernatural sense, the visible presence of the horseshoe gave inhabitants a small, daily reassurance. We have done what we can. We are guarded. Other iron objects served similar functions. Knives or nails could be driven into thresholds or window frames, forming an unseen perimeter. Amulets combining small bits of metal with carved symbols or saints' images might be worn under clothing, felt against the skin like a very private insurance policy. Warriors, especially in Norse and other northern cultures, sometimes carried runic charms or inscribed objects meant to bring luck or protection in battle. Such items did not change the trajectory of an arrow, but they steadied the hand that loosed it and the heart that walked toward the clash. Charms against illness often mingled plant matter, written words, and ritual actions. A string tied around the neck or wrist with a certain number of knots. A prayer repeated a set number of times as a potion was brewed. A small object passed 3 times over a wound. Before being buried, all of these layered a sense of control over events that might otherwise feel completely random. In a world with limited understanding of germs, such rituals provided a framework for hope. Communal rituals, too, had survival value. Processions to bless fields, especially before planting, combined religious piety with a kind of social organization. Walking together along the boundaries of fields, singing or chanting, marked property lines, checked on the condition of ditches and hedges, and gave everyone a shared sense of responsibility for the coming harvest. The prayers may have been for rain or protection from blight, but the practical result was also a form of inspection and planning. On nights thought to be especially dangerous, around certain festivals or transitions of the year, people might hang protective symbols in windows, draw chalk marks on doors, or keep specific herbs burning by the hearth. The smoke, besides satisfying spiritual expectations, had the side effect of repelling insects and perhaps minor pests. When every bite and sting could carry infection, driving away flies and fleas was not trivial. Superstitions could become burdensome, of course. Fear of witches or curses sometimes led to scapegoating and violence. But in their milder forms, these beliefs wear upon communities together, provided psychologically protective stories, and encouraged behaviors that accidentally had survival benefits. Keeping iron tools near, burning certain herbs, walking the boundaries of fields, remembering to honor wells and springs so they would not be casually polluted. The modern mind might smirk at the idea that a bent piece of iron or a few murmured phrases could hold back disease or misfortune. And strictly, in a scientific sense, they could not. But belief itself is a survival tool. People who feel that the universe is not entirely hostile, that there are allies both seen and unseen, often find it easier to endure hard conditions. Medieval villagers, clutching their charms and tracing crosses in the air, thought these gestures helped them live another day. The human record suggests that even if the charms were powerless, the resolve they fostered was not. As night thickened around their houses, as fires settled and charms hung quietly in the rafters, people turned inward, curling up near relatives, listening to the wind in the thatch. Tomorrow would mean more of the same. Watching the sky, tending the fire, preserving what little came in. We have wandered these shadowed paths tonight, through smoke-filled rooms and frozen fields, through quiet acts of preservation and care that rarely make it into grand histories. From salt and smoke to flint and sand, from herbs and splints to iron nailed above doors. Medieval survival was not one big trick, but 1,000 small, stubborn habits repeated without applause. If this slow drift through forgotten techniques has eased your mind a little, or helped you fall asleep to the steady rhythms of other people's struggles, you can gently subscribe, or leave a soft comment when you wake, sharing where and when you were listening. The past will still be here tomorrow night, waiting, patient as ever, with more small stories of how ordinary people quietly refused to vanish. Next, invisible armor, charms, iron, and the superstitions that kept people going. Survival is not purely physical. A person who believes nothing can protect them may give up more quickly, lose will, or make panicked choices. Medieval people wrapped themselves, their homes, and their journeys in a web of symbols meant to anchor them in a dangerous world. Some of those symbols had faint but real practical effects. Others worked mostly through the mind. All of them, in their quiet way, helped stitch fragile lives together against the pull of despair. Take the simple iron horseshoe, nailed above a doorway with careful, deliberate strokes. To the medieval eye, this was not a quaint decoration. It was a barrier against malevolent forces that slipped through cracks in the night. Iron itself, forged in fire and shaped by human will, carried a reputation for repelling witches, fairies, and restless spirits. The curved shape of the horseshoe was said to trap such wanderers like a snare, holding them fast until dawn scattered their power. Whether supernatural or not, the sight of that rusted crescent hanging there, catching faint light from the hearth, gave every person crossing the threshold a small, unspoken reassurance. This place is claimed. This place remembers to defend itself. Other iron objects wove into the same pattern. A knife laid across the cradle of a newborn, its blade gleaming dully in candlelight. Nails driven into doorposts or bed frames, their heads flush against wood that creaked in the wind. Scissors opened and placed beneath a pillow, their blades forming a protective V. These were not casual placements. They followed patterns passed down through whispers and example, each piece of metal a silent sentinel against the unseen. In homes where winters dragged and illness lingered, such gestures cost nothing but offered the illusion, or perhaps the reality, of control. Amulets were carried closer to the skin, small pouches of salt mixed with herbs, sewn shut and worn on a cord around the neck. Bits of rowan wood, believed to ward off enchantment, tucked into clothing hems. For travelers or soldiers, more elaborate charms appeared, inscribed stones, tiny crosses, or runic carvings on bone that promised safeguarding through shadowed forests or clashing shields. A knight might grip such an object before a skirmish, its edges worn smooth by thumb and prayer. The charm did not turn aside steel, but it steadied breath and cleared the mind long enough to swing true. Illness drew out deeper rituals. A feverish child might have a circle of salt drawn round their bed, or a written prayer folded and placed under the mattress. Herbs like vervain or mugwort, burned slowly to release acrid smoke, filled the room with a scent meant to drive away evil influences. The smoke stung the eyes and clung to hair, but it also cleared insects from the air and perhaps soothed ragged breathing. With its earthy sharpness, words were spoken over poultices, blessings, charms, fragments of scripture repeated in rhythmic cadence that lulled both healer and patient into a shared rhythm of hope. Houses themselves became fortresses of symbol, doors marked with chalk crosses on certain nights, windows strung with garlic or hawthorn sprigs, thresholds swept clean at dusk, not just for neatness, but to erase invisible tracks left by wandering entities. In some regions, a fire was kindled anew each spring with carefully selected wood, the old coals scattered to the four winds as a way of renewing protection for the year ahead. These acts blurred into daily chores. As a woman raked the hearth, she might murmur a phrase her grandmother taught her, the words as automatic as the sweep of the broom. Communal defenses amplified the personal. Village processions wound through fields at planting time, priests or elders carrying relics and sprinkling holy water that doubled as a check on fences and ditches. Boundaries were walked, hedges inspected, shared wells blessed with salt and prayer. What began as spiritual observance ended with practical gains. Fences mended, ditches cleared, neighbors reminded of their stake in each other's survival. The chants echoed softly across the landscape, birds wheeling overhead. the air heavy with damp earth and expectation. Not all charms were benign. Fear of curses sometimes twisted into accusation. Neighbor turned against neighbor in a hunt for the source of blight or fever. But most days, most superstitions stayed gentle, woven into the fabric of endurance. A spilled salt cellar demanded a pinch thrown over the shoulder. A black cat crossing a path called for a quiet gesture of warding. These small pauses in the day reset the mind, reminded the body that patterns existed even in chaos. There is subtle sarcasm in how the universe tested these beliefs. A horseshoe might hang faithfully for decades, only to see the house beneath it burn from a careless ember. A charm clutched in battle might end in a grave. Yet the rituals persisted, because abandoning them felt like surrendering the last thread of agency. Medieval people thought a bent nail or murmured verse could bend fate. Strictly, in isolation, it could not, but layered across a life, across a village. It fostered resilience, the kind that keeps feet moving through mud, hands grinding grain in the dark, eyes scanning the horizon for dawn. That quiet persistence outlasted iron. As night deepened and charms hung silent in the rafters, people turned to rest. Bodies curled in shared warmth. But even sleep had its techniques, drawn from centuries of watching what worked when exhaustion threatened to overwhelm. Then, the craft of unbroken rest. Medieval sleep habits that fought fatigue and fever dream sleep in the medieval world was not the solid 8 hours modern life chases. It was segmented, watchful, shaped by the realities of cold nights, communal living, and the ever-present need to rise for chores or threats. Yet within this fragmented pattern lay survival wisdom. Rest in phases. Use the body's rhythms. Protect the vulnerable hours of unconsciousness. The classic first sleep began after dusk. Bodies settling into straw or feather as the hearth dimmed to coals. Darkness wrapped the room like a heavy cloth, broken only by faint glows from banked embers or moonlight slipping through shutters. People slept in waves, some deeply, others lightly, attuned to small sounds, a child's cough, a shutter rattle, the distant low of cattle. Around midnight or 1, many woke naturally, a watch period unfolding in quiet wakefulness. Candles might be lit briefly, prayers murmured, or small tasks done by ember light, mending a seam, stirring pottage left warming, or simply sitting in companionable silence with others similarly roused. This biphasic sleep matched the body's own chemistry, avoiding the deadened slump of total exhaustion. Urine collected during the watch was sometimes used medicinally, fresh for eye washes, aged for dyes or laundry, turning a biological necessity into resource. The air in these waking hours carried a stillness, broken by soft crackles from the fire, the rustle of someone shifting position, the occasional sigh as sleep beckoned again. Second sleep followed until dawn, lighter now, ready for the rooster's call or the first grey light. Beds were designed for shared efficiency. A family might pile into one frame, adults at the center radiating heat outward to children at the edges. In winter, cloaks and extra blankets formed a communal mound, breaths mingling in warm clouds. Lice and fleas were constant companions, combed out each morning with bone or wooden tools. But the trade-off, survival warmth, outweighed the itch. Straw pallets, stuffed with fresh rushes in spring and turned regularly, trapped air and body heat while discouraging deeper infestations through periodic replacement. Positions mattered subtly, curled on sides or fetal, knees to chest, minimized exposed skin. Heads rested on bolsters of wool or buckwheat husks, which conformed without flattening, keeping airways open against damp colds. In fevers, cooler cloths were laid on foreheads, or feet warmed with stones to draw heat downward. Monasteries refined this further. Monks slept in dormitories on inclined boards to prevent deep slumber, rising promptly for matins, their discipline a model of controlled rest that sustained grueling prayer schedules. Dreams, too, were navigated with care. Nightmares might be countered by waking fully, crossing oneself, and reciting a paternoster before settling again. Herbal pillows, lavender, hops, or mugwort stuffed into linen released soothing scents, easing into sleep without narcotic haze. The faint, dry rustle of husks under cheek, the slow release of herbal fragrance, turned the bed into a gentle pharmacopoeia. Modern sleep science nods to some of this. Biphasic patterns reduce insomnia. Shared beds conserve heat efficiently. Natural awakenings align with circadian dips. Medieval people discovered these not through study, but through the blunt test of winter nights, where poor rest meant weakened bodies and fatal errors. They thought rising in the dark watch preserved strength. Bodies kept healing through it. From slumber as quiet grip emerged the day as first demands, tending animals whose lives mirrored human fragility. Livestock was not scenery or wealth on the hoof. It was walking insurance against starvation, milk, cheese, eggs, wool, meat, manure for fields, even draft power for plows. Losing animals to cold, disease, or neglect rippled through families like a dropped stone in still water. So medieval care was meticulous, opportunistic, turning barns and pastures into extensions of the preservation arts already learned. Cows and oxen wintered in low, draft-proof sheds adjoining houses, their body heat bleeding through wattle walls to warm human spaces. Animals bedded deep in straw or bracken-formed natural composting heaps, generating additional warmth from fermentation while absorbing waste. The air in such barns was thick. Ammonia tang, warm hay, animal breath condensing on rafters. Handlers mucked out regularly, spreading the rich sludge on frozen fields where it thawed into fertilizer come spring. Sheep, hardy but theft-prone, clustered in folds near steadings, watched by dogs whose barking wove into night soundscapes. Shepherds used hurdles, portable wattle fences, to shift flocks to fresh grass or sheltered lee sides, minimizing mud and parasites. Wool was sheared in patterns that left enough insulation for cold snaps, then carded and spun into the blankets already praised for trapping warmth. Pigs, forest foragers by preference, rooted under oaks for mast, their keepers marking trees with cuts to claim seasonal rights. Fattened on acorns and scraps, they converted woodland scraps into hams that hung beside their smoked kin. Sows farrowed in straw nests within barns, litters warmed by siblings' bodies in instinctive piles. Chickens scratched in coops reinforced against foxes, eggs collected at dawn to foil rats. Geese patrolled boundaries, their honks an alarm system, feathers plucked sustainably for pillows and quills. Bees and skeps, woven straw domes, yielded honey for preservation and pollination for crops. Hives moved to shelter when gales loomed. Disease struck ruthlessly, but responses were swift. Isolation of sick beasts, herbal washes for mange, tar daubed on wounds. Midwifery for calvings involved gentle pulls and warm straw baths for newborns. Veterinary law, passed orally, included purgatives from herbs to clear gut worms, saving animals and thus families from collapse. Sarcasm lingers. Beasts demanded more daily fuss than children, yet their loss doomed all. Medieval pens pulsed with life-supporting rhythm. Feed, shelter, watch, repeat. They thought rubbing fat on a lamb's nose eased birth. Generations grazed because it did. With animals secured, eyes lifted to the sky, where weather's whims demanded their own forgotten reeds. No Alps pinged alerts. Medieval survival hinged on eyes, joints, beasts, and subtle cues from Earth itself. Weather lore, honed over lifetimes, turned patterns into predictions that guided sowing, reaping, shelter building. Failure here meant empty larders. Success stretched scant harvests. Dawn skies held first clues. Red east promised wind, its glow bleeding into clouds like spilled wine on cloth. Halos around moon foretold rain. Ice crystals in upper air bending light into rings. Mist rising slow from valleys signaled frost. Rapid lift meant thaw. Animals betrayed shifts. Birds flying low hugged coming storms. Cows lying in pastures called thunder. Pigs carrying sticks built nests for gales. Joint aches in elders, long accurate as barometers, warned of pressure drops. Soil told truths. Dew heavy on grass-fed dry days. Spider webs tight signaled wet. Earthworms surfacing begged rain. Ants frenetic built mounds. Farmers probed furrows. Clay cracking deeply screamed drought. Worms absent whispered flood. Plant omens layered in. Pine cones opening begged dryness. Oak leaves curling inside doubt cried storm. Dandelion clocks fluffing early chased wind. These were not wincy, but calendars etched in leaf and bowl, checked daily like a pulse. Land mending followed reeds. Terracing hillsides held soil on slopes. Contour plowing followed hill curves, trapping water. Crop rotation, wheat, fallow, beans, rebuilt soil without chemicals, legumes fixing nitrogen in quiet alchemy. Manure, ash, marl spread meticulously fed earth back into itself. Hedgerows, windbreaks of hawthorn and blackthorn, laced fields into protected webs. Berries feeding foragers, birds nesting to devour pests. Ditches drained floods, fed livestock. Woodlots coppiced sustainably yielded poles, fodder, fuel without bearing hills to erosion. Communes enforced it. Reeves tallied rotations, fined wasters. Individuals watched microsigns. A field's frog chorus swelling signaled wet to avoid sowing. They thought a haloed moon meant cover ricks. Ricks stood because it did. Clouds gathered slow. Winds whispered through thatch. Another technique waited in the rear guard. Evasion when land betrayed utterly. Stability was ideal. Reality often evicted. War, famine, plague uprooted thousands yearly. Survival then meant mobile kits, knowledge of temporary harbor, foraging en route, shelters from naught but hands and horizon. Medieval roads teemed with such wanderers. Their techniques a shadowy codex of endurance. A family flees scorched fields, bundles on backs, children clutching skirts. Paths avoid main roads, bandit bait, hugging riverbanks, wood edges for cover, water. Pace 20 miles a day, slow with little legs. Halts at hedgerows for sorrel, nuts, streams for boiling if time. Nightfall demands shelter, best abandoned barns, hay-scented, wind-blocked, doors barred with poles, fire tiny in clay hollows to hide glow. None. Bended tents from cloaks propped on sticks, of frames of saplings thatched in bracken. Snow caves in drifts, tunnel in, dome hollowed, meltra freeze seals walls. Vigor warms, shared bodies huddle core. Firecraft amplifies, tinder bundles carried, flint steel pendants, lifelong companions. Wet wood, inner heart wood shaved dry, fat wood resin scraped. Smoke signals veiled to evade pursuit. Water en route, upstream sources, avoid cattle wallows. Cloth strain, boil via stones if potless. Berries pinch thirst, avoided nightshade kin. Navigation by moss north on oaks, sunset west, stars slow wheel. Communities absorb some. Monasteries fed pilgrims, alms at gates. Hostels strung pilgrimage routes, straw pallets for pence. Vagrancy laws tightened later, but margins held space for itinerant smiths. Harvesters migrating seasonally, skills traded, scythe sharpening for bread. Women birthed roadside, midwives among walkers. Sick lagged, mercy kills whispered taboo. Children learned fast, snare rabbits, read hoofprints for game trails. Sarcasm in fates, displaced thought stars guided true. Roads led somewhere, graves fewer. Paths converged on opportunity. Harvest gangs, army camps, ports for shipwork. Temporary meant provisional, but chains of havens stitched survival. As wanderers found footing, minds turned to unseen foes within, cleaning without soaps. Banishing vermin softly, cleanliness shadowed survival, uncelebrated. No plumbing, yet houses scrubbed, bodies washed, parasites checked lest they weaken unto death. Medieval hygiene was ritual, herbal, communal, a daily grind yielding invisible victories. Lice-combed dawn, bone teeth scraping scalps over basins. Nits crushed deliberate, eggshell crunch intimate as prayer. Heads vinegar doused, acrid sting chasing hatchlings. Garments beaten outside, sun killing eggs on lines. Fleas leapt beds, bites inflamed. Straw changed fortnightly, infested burnt. Fleabane herbs, pennyroyal, wormwood, stuffed pallets, sharp scents repelling. Floors lime-washed yearly, caustic powders sealing cracks. Walls daubed cowding clay, dung's ammonia natural bleach. Baths weekly where possible. Ashly soaps from hearth leavings, fat rendered harsh but foaming. Public stews steamy, gossip hubs doubling delousing. Private, tub by fire, hot stones hissing plunge. Hands washed pre-meal, grey stime rinse. Teeth scrubbed salt, urine swills whitening. Toothpicks hawthorn, floss unwaxed linen. Mouths sage chewed, astringent against rot. Nails clipped, cuticles herb-oiled fend cracks. Kitchens vigilant, pots vinegar scoured, boards salt scrubbed, flies trapped vinegar bowls, wasps honey baited, rats, cat patrolled, snares barn set, grain silos raised platforms, Cats' nests beneath. Women led. Menstrual rags boiled juniper. Reusable. Child diapers moss-lined. Antibacterial. Changed field frequent. Latrines downhill. Lime dusted. Fly discouraged. Wells roped off washing. Thought quaint. These preserved strength for labor. Vermin felled more than swords. Hacks prevailed. Shadows lengthened. Techniques circled back to origin. Outlasting siege, starvation, storm in walls of wood and will. We've wandered these shadowed paths tonight, from salted barrels to starlit trails, from fleek oaks to fate charms, through every quiet stubbornness that turned medieval winters survivable. Salt drew moisture from meat, flint sparked life from ash, thatch trapped warmth like whispered secrets, water sands filtered peril away. Charms steadied hearts when bodies faltered. Sleep phases renewed without collapse. Beasts warned barns that warmed homes. Skies foretold without satellites. Wanderers bent branches into havens. Cones scraped unseen enemies. These forgotten arts, repeated nameless, wove endurance from despair.